Good day, listeners, and welcome back to Delta Module 1 Radio. I'm your host, Shadi R. Abu Yusuf, here to take you on a whistle-stop tour through the fascinating, chaotic, and often quirky history of language teaching. Think of it as the Netflix of ELT history, minus the binge watching, but definitely with some plot twists. Today's episode, the wild ride through language teaching history. Grab your metaphorical popcorn because this story has everything. Monasteries, marketplaces, Elizabethan smocks, and yes, grammar. Lots and lots of grammar. Let's dive in. Now, before you imagine the history of language teaching as a nice, orderly progression, like a queue for afternoon tea, think again. This is more like the queue at a busy London Underground station. Chaotic, overlapping, and sometimes involving someone insisting on doing things the old way. Some methods dominated certain parts of the world, others quietly stayed in the shadows. It's messy, but fascinating. One big misconception is that we've moved steadily from boring and academic teaching to fun, practical methods, culminating in the fantastic classes we teach today. But as we'll see, it's a bit more complicated than that. In the early days, language teaching had two big players, the monastery tradition and the marketplace tradition. The monastery tradition focused on teaching Greek and Latin, grammatical, academic, and definitely not the place for a laugh. Picture rows of monks memorizing declensions by candlelight. Fun times. Meanwhile, in the marketplace, people were learning languages to trade, haggle, and presumably argue about the price of fish. A good example? In 1586, Jacques Bellow wrote his familiar dialogues for Huguenot refugees in London. Here is a gem of a conversation. "Peter, where laid you your nightcap?" "I left it upon the bed." "Are you ready, Peter?" "How should I be ready? You brought me a smock instead of my shirt." "I forgot myself. Hold, here is your shirt." "Now you're a good wench." Elizabethan domestic drama at its finest. And here is the kicker. This dialogue, written over 400 years ago, is essentially the same kind of situational dialogue we use today. Swap nightcap for smartphone, and you've got a modern textbook. Proof that we have always been recycling ideas, even before it was trendy. Fast forward to the 19th century, and language teaching became more systematic with the grammar translation method. This method was essentially, let's teach modern languages the way we taught Latin and Greek. It involved grammar rules, translation tasks, and endless conjugations. Sound familiar? Here is an example. "You have put on your stockings." "I have done my exercise." "He has spoken wisely." Not exactly edge of your seat content, is it? But it worked, for grammar at least. Context, not so much. Now, many of us learned languages this way, chanting verb forms, translating sentences, and rarely speaking a word of the language we were learning. And while it's been heavily criticized for lacking communication and focusing on isolated grammar points, some techniques have made a comeback. For example, translation is being reimagined as a valuable tool for noticing differences and similarities between languages. Advanced learners might even critique movie subtitles to see how well meaning is conveyed. Proof that grammar translation isn't entirely stuck in the past. What's the moral of the story? Well, there is no such thing as a perfect teaching method. Each one has its strengths, weaknesses, and hilarious quirks. As teachers, our job is to pick and choose the best bits for our students. So whether you're a grammar enthusiast or a communicative maverick, remember, the history of language teaching isn't a straight line. It's a rich tapestry, or if you prefer, a messy classroom whiteboard. That's it for today's episode of Delta Module 1 Radio. I hope you enjoyed our romp through the annals of ELT history. Join me next time as we explore a method that shook things up with one radical idea. Ditch the translation and speak the language from day one. Spoiler alert, it's called the direct method, and it's as controversial as it's intriguing. This is Shadi Abu Yusuf signing off. Remember, stay curious, keep learning, and don't forget your nightcap. See you next time. Bye, fellas.